So I was saying that I wish this topic was not as current, but that said, we need to talk about current affairs and we need to be informed about what's happening. And as a historian, I always like to give a historical perspective on things. And I am one of those rare people that still believes in facts. And still believes that there's something out there that is worth understanding before you form an opinion. So today my goal is to place this question in historical context, give you tons of information, probably too much, but I'm going to be very kind of like didactic and we're going to be fine. And then at the end, I am more than willing to entertain any questions that you may have, absolutely about anything. So I named this the Muslim question in quotation marks, and that was a provocative title that maybe not everyone got it, in the sense that it was referring to the 19th century Jewish question. So in the 19th century, there were all these debates about what to do with the Jewish minorities that were living all over Europe. And the problem was that they were perceived to be minorities that were threatening, that were not assimilating, that were more loyal to the religion than they were to the nations where they were living in. They were minorities that were in solidarity with each other, not with the rest of the society where they were living in. And thus, eventually, they were perceived as a threat. Of course, that threat could be that anti-Semitism could be more or less pernicious. In France, it was very difficult with something called the Dreyfus Affair. That was a big scandal at the end of the 19th century, but it didn't turn into something even more ominous as it happened in Germany in the interwar period and then later on with the Nazi regime. So the Jewish question and the anti-Semitism that was pervasive all over Europe for centuries, but in the 19th century it coalesced into a sort of a movement that led later on into the Holocaust, is not that dissimilar with what I call the Muslim question. The thing is that we are still at early stages and we can still do something about it. So we can avoid falling into the same traps that we fell in the 19th century with the Jewish question, again today with the Muslim question. And that's what I'm trying to get at. So, after the events, the terrorist attack in New Zealand, myself, as I'm sure all of you, have been exposed to a lot of debates and comments, and maybe the younger crowd more than the older one, but there's a lot of things being said in social media that we are all exposed to. So while I'm talking today, I would like you to keep these kind of like 4 myths in mind. They're not the only ones, but are the ones that I've been addressing in the last few days more often than not. So those are things that I would like you to keep in mind while I'm talking. The first myth is that there's a Muslim takeover of Europe. In France, they call it the Great Replacement. The Great Replacement. And in other parts, they call it in more kind of like the dark web, the white genocide. So the idea that because Muslims have a higher birth rate and they are immigrating in great numbers, eventually Europe will cease to be a continent where Caucasian people have been the dominant group. And that's where the idea of Eurasia comes from. So Islam and Muslims as an invader. That's the first myth. The second one is that some cultures are incompatible with Western values, in particular Islam, which is something that is very pervasive today, and it's done and said without taking into account that that very same thing was said in the 19th century about Jews. It was said in many instances about other minorities, being it Italian or Jews or Irish. Myth number 3 is that Islam is not a religion, it's an ideology. And because it's not a religion, it's an ideology, then it has to be opposed as other ideologies are opposed. And finally, the fourth myth is that Muslims demand Sharia law and oppose minority and women's rights, and they are not suitable to live in Western countries. So these are kind of like the 4 myths that I would like you to keep in mind while I'm discussing things. So let's go to the invasion. So these are kind of like the actual numbers of presumed Muslims in the European Union countries. So you can see that the one which has the largest number is Germany, followed by France, and United Kingdom, Italy, Bulgaria, Netherlands, Spain, Belgium, Greece, and Austria. Those are kind of like the largest numbers. But really numbers are difficult, because how do we know who is a Muslim? Because countries like France, they don't take statistics based on religion. They only take statistics based on place of origin. So you could be a person that comes from Morocco and you are immediately counted as a Muslim. But you could be an atheist. You could be a Gnostic. You could be kind of like different sorts of believer. So in that sense, those statistics really do not really reflect the numbers of Muslims in Europe. We don't really know. Those are kind of like estimates. But of course, numbers do not say much as long as they are not put in context with the rest of the population. So what's the percentage of Muslims in Europe? Can we really talk about an invasion? So we have countries that have very, what did I do? Countries that have, in very light green, minimal percentage as related to the population. The countries that are in darker green, for instance, France or Germany, as we saw before, Germany had the largest number of Muslims, but not the largest percentage of Muslims per population, which goes to France, with 8.8%, right? 8.8%. I'm not sure I would call this an invasion. But that's just me. Now, projections. Maybe the invasion is coming. Well, we have in 1990 to 2030, we have, this is the accumulated number for the whole European Union, and we can see that eventually there will be a significant number of millions of Muslims in Europe. But as compared to the rest of the European population, I don't think that it's worth, like this little green here, is worth calling it Eurabia or the Muslim takeover of Europe. Because if these 58 million have to take over those 669, they're going to have, I want to know how they're going to do it. Because maybe, I don't know, maybe we can learn from that and do it ourselves in other countries. That's a pretty significant takeover of the population. So if the actual numbers, the actual percentages, and the actual projection are not warranted, this idea of the fear of an invasion, where is that coming from? Is that do people not believe in that? And now we get in trouble. But before I go to Europe, I said in the title that I was going to deal with America too. So these are statistics about Muslims in America. And as you can see, very few regions have dark red, which is 5% of more of Muslims in the population of that particular county. So Islam is actually the third religion in America. After Christianity, well, I don't know if we should count non-affiliated. So 70% or so are Christians or declare themselves Christians, like 23% or so declare themselves non-affiliated in terms of religious matters. Then you have 1.9 that declare themselves to be Jews, and 1.1 that declare themselves to be Muslims. That makes it technically the third religion in America, but it's 1.1. It's not a very big number. It's also, we're going to talk in a second about, because these are all numbers, and numbers don't tell us a lot about where do they come from or what kind of composition is there. But let's see now where the idea of the invasion comes from. And now is when we get in real trouble, because the actual numbers are in dark red. The perception of the numbers are in yellow. So in France, the actual number we said before was 8.8. The perception of the French people, of the Muslims that live among themselves, is all the way to 33%.
Wow.
So they think that a third of the population are Muslims, when in reality it's 8.8. And that applies to every single country. There's no exceptions. Even the United States, the percentage is, I would say that here it's even more than 1.1. It's not that. 1.1 would be even less. But the percentage is that we have as many Muslims as we have Latinos.
That's our perception, or
That's,
the Muslim perception?
that's the perception, everybody's perception. So the problem here is that the visibility and the perception of the Muslim question is way out of proportion to its reality. That's one of the difficulties that we have here. So let's see, where are these Muslims coming from? And let's go to see how they arrive and their characteristics. So yeah, I know, this is like, I love this picture, because like Turkish guest workers in Germany, they just couldn't hide. They just love their mustaches. They just like, it just gives them away. So Muslims in Europe, besides a few areas like Albania or Bulgaria or some areas that are within the old Soviet Union, they are Muslims by either conversion or by immigration. And most of the immigration came in the post-World War II period, when there was an economic miracle and millions of workers were needed for the reconstruction of Europe that had been destroyed by the war. And those workers were found initially in Italy, Greece, Portugal, and Spain, that were poor countries in the southern part of Europe, and they went to work in Belgium, France, Germany, and all these parts. But when those workers were not enough, those countries had to go and recruit workers in other parts. So in Germany, they went to Turkey. In France, they went to Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. And they were competing for these workers because they desperately needed them. And they were called guest workers, which is not dissimilar to any kind of like temporary working program. They were invited to come to European countries for 2 years. During those 2 years, they were supposed to work hard, save, and then return to their countries with their savings. It didn't work. It didn't work because there were too many incentives for those workers to stay and for their employers to let them stay. Because they were trained. The good ones stayed. The ones that they wanted to stay, stayed. The other ones, okay, you maybe can return to Turkey, but we want you to stay. We've invested in you, you're good for the factory, why should we train workers every 2 years? We need them. So there was all this like population that arrived and stayed. So by 1976, even though German authorities thought that they were not a country of immigration, 4 million Turks were living in Germany and working in Germany. Now comes the oil crisis in 1973-74, and then you have all those European countries trying to get rid of all these workers, but it was too late. Because they had been there for decades, they had brought their families, they had had children in Germany, and even though there were incentives for them to go back, they didn't want to go back. So we have economic migrations in the post-war period. We also have colonial migrations, because European countries had all these empires, and when they had to leave them, part of the colonial populations were forced to go back to the metropolis with them because they had been tainted by colonialism and they could not stay behind. Their lives were at risk, or some of them just preferred to go back to the former metropolitan power. So we have colonial migrations, we have guest workers, and then we have a lot of refugees. And refugees is something that keeps coming because the European borders are very close to many areas in conflict. That's Europe. So these populations, if you think who they were, they are working class immigrants, most of them. They go to Europe to work in unskilled jobs. Some of the colonial migrations may be not the case, some of them were more educated, but overall it's a working class population. They arrive in Europe, and where do they live? Downtown Paris? Of course not. They go and live wherever they can. They go and live in the peripheries. They go and live in all those like horrible, brutalist buildings that were enacted in the 1960s for them to live in. Because they were not meant to stay. Those are just temporary locations for them to be. So you have a lot of kind of like, in the outskirts, a lot of kind of like ghetto-like neighborhoods where these kind of migrants arrived, and some of them had to stay because they had no other options to go to any other fancier or more expensive part of town. So Muslims in America or in Canada do not follow the same pattern. First, they are to a much number. The numbers are way smaller than they are in Europe. But also, Muslims in America have had a different kind of like socioeconomic background. It's way more difficult to get to America. It's, you need more capital to invest, you need more education to invest. You need, even if you came in the 19th century, you had some other networks, being merchants or being other things. So it's not the same kind of unskilled population that makes it to Canada or to the United States. So our Muslim populations in America are different than the ones we get in Europe. We don't have the same concentrations. We don't have the same arrivals en masse. We don't have the same shantytowns that we had in European cities. We also have in America a much larger number of converts. So about 25% of Muslims in America are African Americans, and they've converted to Islam in the 20th century slowly. In Europe, the converts are a tiny minority. Most of Muslims in Europe are either immigrants, they're European-born children, some converts, and of course, when I'm talking about this, I don't want you at all to think that this is a new phenomenon. Because in France, we are already in the 4th generation. These gentlemen here already have great-grandchildren. So in this sense, I mean, we are talking about generations of European-born Muslims. Okay, so why am I talking about this? I'm not a Muslim myself. I mean, why am I talking about this? So I'm a historian, and I do history of migration. I'm interested in why people move. I'm interested in the reasons, how they engage with the society where they arrive, and how the difficulties they have once they arrive there. So my PhD was about Muslims in Spain, mostly from Morocco and Pakistan, but also converts. And my question was, at the time, if it's really true that Muslim immigrants are really challenging Western values, wouldn't they be more successful in a country like Spain that is transferring from a dictatorship to a democracy? It really doesn't have a very well-established democratic system, so it would be an opportunity for anyone that is undemocratically minded to wreak havoc in the country. So let's see what happened in Spain since they transferred from a dictatorship to a democracy in 1975, and then they have all this arrival of Muslim immigrants and converts. What did they do? How did they engage in this process of building a democracy? And that was my PhD, eventually a book with a nice painting.
Oh, yes.
Right?
Oh, yes.
My husband did it, so I don't accept any kind of
Very
like.
nice. Very nice.
Thank you. So what I would like to talk about the second part of this talk is about the current struggle for civil rights and belonging. And the idea is that I would like to point out some strategies of inclusion that Muslims are using and some barriers to inclusion. And then I will welcome more than any questions. So let's see, strategies of inclusion. One of the premise here is to be a citizen, or at least to have permanent status. So just a rough estimate. Who among us here is, like me, an alien? Just me? 2 of us. So we are the ones with most precarious status. It's important to be a permanent resident, because otherwise you can be kicked out at any time. But who is an American citizen here? You raise your hands. So you are the privileged ones. You are the ones that actually have the political power to determine how things operate here. At the same time, unless you are naturalized American citizens, you may not have a very good idea of how actually difficult it is to be an American citizen or a permanent resident, how difficult it is to get here. So the US is not that different. European countries are sometimes worse. So for instance, in Canada, and I was born in Spain, I was an American, Spanish citizen, but I also became a Canadian citizen. That was fairly easy. 3 years of permanent residency, a very easy exam, a ceremony, that was about it. In Spain, if you are a Muslim, you need 10 years of residency, uninterrupted. If you go back home to visit your family in Morocco, the counting starts again. 10 years uninterrupted residence. I would never have become a Canadian that way. I want to see my family in Spain. I have a job that forces me to travel all over the world. What is this? The problem is that not everyone has to follow that. If you are from Latin America, all the countries in red, which are the former Spanish Empire, so if you are from Latin America but not Portugal, just Ibero-America, Portuguese, Filipino, Andorran, Equatorial Guinean, Sephardic Jews, because they were expelled from Spain in 1492, and those from the city of Gibraltar, these persons are entitled to the consideration of being preferred residents and citizens, because it can be assumed that they have an affinity of culture or identity with Spain. Sounds good. In 2 years, you become a Spanish citizen. 2 years. That's pretty good. That's even better than Canada. However, when you look at Sephardic Jews that were expelled from Spain, anyone in the room that has a little bit of a knowledge of medieval Spain would say, wait a second. Didn't someone else also was expelled from Spain? Just a few years later, in 1614, 1618. Who are those again? Oh, the Muslims that had been forced to convert to Christianity, that were called Moriscos, those were expelled too. How come they're not here? Oh, that's bizarre, because if the Sephardic Jews were expelled in 1492, the Moriscos that were expelled in 1614, they should be here as well, but they are not. Bizarre. But that's not the only inconsistency, because you see all this fancy kind of like Spanish Empire. You see this chunk here? That's northern Morocco. And there's a little chunk here that should be there, but it's here, Western Sahara. Those are excluded too. So every single population that was Muslim that had historical affinities with Spain was excluded from this preferential treatment. That makes no sense. It cannot be justified under any circumstance except that there was a particular rule only applicable to Muslims. So this is 1985, and it hasn't changed. So in this sense, the access to citizenship and the access to permanent residency is more difficult for Muslims. In your own country today, there's a Muslim ban. The people from those countries are not going to get permanent residency. They are not even going to step a foot in this country. And there's no justification really for it. So we need to be very careful about one of the main struggles, and the way it was portrayed, it happened historically in France, in Italy, in Spain, is that there were a lot of strikes, there were a lot of hunger strikes, there were a lot of demonstrations of undocumented immigrants, many of them Muslims, in order to get status and eventually have access to citizenship. So this is one of the first struggles that we can see, that in order to be part of the society, you need to have the status and the citizenship to be able to participate. What happens when you do have them? Do we see famous clash of civilizations? Well, when you have the papers, what happened is this. Not just good-looking men, but also the mayor of London and the mayor of Calgary are both Muslims, elected by a majority non-Muslim population. And quite popular. I mean, the mayor of London has to still be re-elected, and I think he will. But the mayor of Calgary in Canada, a big city in Alberta, he was elected 3 times already. The first time with 39% of the vote, the second time with 74% of the vote, the third time with 51% of the popular vote. He's still there, practicing Muslim. I mean, this is the kind of example that you look for. Is there really a clash here? Is there really an incompatibility of values? Well, I mean, you may agree or disagree with the policies, but the fact that they are Muslims is irrelevant. What are they doing for their cities? Which kind of program do they have for the cities? That's what we should be looking at. You know them, right? Finally, we get them. Finally, we have Muslim-born women elected to the American Congress. I mean, this is a great success. I came in this country in July 2016. And then in November 2016, I was like, why did I came? No one told me this was going to happen. I could have stayed in Europe. I mean, it's not perfect by any means, but really? Do I have to be an alien in this country without any possibility to do anything and really having others elect things for me? This is really uncomfortable. In 2019 was like, okay, I'm ready to leave. Unless there's some significant change here and I see myself more reflected in this country, what am I doing here? And then women like this were elected, and I'm like, okay. maybe there's a glimpse of hope that we are kind of embracing diversity. Because the question here is not whether I agree or disagree with them. The question here is that I am proud that they are where they are and they can speak for different voices. Because the politics of presence is extremely important. Having a woman, a veiled woman in Congress, sends the message that, hey, it's okay. You know that veils are banned in French public schools. Full veiling is banned in Belgium, in France. They are trying to do it in the Netherlands. So, I mean, it's just normalizing things. And of course, I mean, no one would think of her as a submissive woman. A little bit of a stretch. So first, citizenship and status. And what do you do when you have them? You become active in politics. You become engaged in the society. You contribute to society. You make the society better by having your voice represented. The second thing is religious rights. And this, in the case of Spain, was very clear that that was one of the things that Muslims in Spain, the first constitution, 1978, recognizes religious pluralism in a country that had never recognized religious pluralism. And had expelled all the minorities, the Jews, the Muslims, had forced them to convert. So it's not a country that has a lot of practice in religious pluralism. But this was 1978, and the country had to, well, liberal rights. Religious pluralism is very well established. So the constitution recognized it, not thinking that anyone was going to actually ask for it. And then the Muslims in Spain were like, this is fantastic, great. Can we get on the same kind of like footing as the Catholic Church? Because since the state is recognizing and helping and funding the Catholic Church, we could use some help too. And then the Protestants said, hey, we're here too. Can we get them too? So eventually the state recognized all the different religions and had agreements of cooperation with them. They are not on par with the Catholic Church. That was a battle that they didn't quite win. But they were asking for religious rights and the cooperation of the state in guaranteeing those religious rights. The main contention is also the building of mosques. And the building of mosques has been very contentious because mosques represent visibility. We are here to stay. We are not guest workers anymore that are going to return somewhere else. This is our home. And since this is our home, we need a place to pray. So visibility is really important. So of course, when you want a mosque, you want to have like a visible mosque, like the one in Rome, the great mosques in Madrid, in many European cities. But you don't get it right away. Why not? Because you have a lot of neighborhood opposition. Over there it says no to mosque. So this idea of, yeah, mosques in theory are very good, but not in my neighborhood. Not in this neighborhood, somewhere else. Maybe in the industrial area over there, where no one can see it. So a lot of, in many Spanish towns, they call them industrial mosques, because they are not downtown. They've been forced to go to the outskirts where all the industrial factories are, where no one can see them, and where it's very difficult to get to. So in that sense, they are not part of the town. They are not embraced as part of the town. And in some cases, that was absolutely illegal, because there was one case in the region of Spain of Catalonia where the Muslim community bought the plot, had the permits, everything was legal, they were ready to start building the mosque when all the neighbors organized, and eventually they were forced to go somewhere else. Because neither the city hall, nor the regional authorities, nor the state authorities supported them in their venture. So visibility is important, the dignity of having like prayer spaces that are not garages. I'm not really sure this is the case in, it's certainly not the case in Canada as much, and I don't think it's the case in California as much, because we still, I mean, we fight for space and it's very pricey, but we still have it. But in Spain, in Italy, mosques are very inadequate. They are just like in garages, they are just like in places that should be like, they really don't have a lot of the safety features that they should have. And sometimes on Fridays or on occasions for Eid, there's too many people praying and they have to go on the street, and then everyone complains about Muslims praying on the street. And all of that is because it's so difficult to find places that are dignified in order to pray. So having visible mosques, dignified places, being treated equally by public authorities, all those are struggles that are not resolved in any way. And now we go into the safety issue. Unfortunately, mosques have been increasingly targets for anti-Muslim terrorism. We'll get into terrorism in a second. So mosques have to be safe, have to feel safe, and increasingly that is not the case. That is a terrible loss for all of us, regardless of who we are or whether we are religious or not, because one of the main tenets of a liberal democracy is that we can all be free to pray to whoever we deem suitable, without fearing for our lives, and that the society values and acknowledges our right. And this safety right now, it's in question. And then the last one, and that's the most controversial, is the autonomy. Precisely because of the safety that comes from mosques being under attack, but also mosques being under suspicion. Because of what's the sermon saying, what's the imam's line of thinking, what are they preaching in that mosque? And the suspicion that they could be preaching to commit terrorist attacks makes a lot of governments, like for instance France, try to control the imams and set up schools for imams so that they have a French Islam and the imams cannot come from other countries. They try to curtail the autonomy of the religious community, which is an interference from the state to the religious community. And that is a very difficult thing. You can do like the French, that you control the imams, or you can do like the Canadians. The Canadians said, well, look, we have difficulties with people that are recruiting young and vulnerable men and women to go and fight in Syria. We have difficulties with radicalization, but we don't want to tell you what to do in your mosques, but we need your help. So either you look at it yourselves or we look at it, but someone has to look at it because we can't live like this. So there's a lot of cooperation between the Muslim communities in Canada and the state security agencies because they trust each other. But it's premised on autonomy. It's not premised on interference and telling you what to do in your mosque. Now, another thing they are trying to do is changing narratives. You can see here, this looks very belligerent, but they are all ethnic Spaniards dressed like medieval Moors, fighting a battle against Christians. The Christians are going to win. They win every year. And they take the arms of the Moors, and they take the captain, they force the captain to give all of his clothing and all of his, like the sword and his kind of like authority, and they force him to convert to Christianity. And then the ceremony is like, okay, we're friends again, let's go and celebrate and drink beer. So that's pretty much kind of like, I know some people look at me, it can get worse. It's called the Festival of Moors and Christians, and it's still celebrated in Spain, and they are celebrating when the Christians conquered the Islamic Spain. I know, it sounds really bizarre. So what Muslims in Spain are trying to do is trying to change the narrative, saying, look, we know that there were Muslims in Spain, we know that there were Christians, we know that there was a war, the Christians won, but you know what? Can we just not embrace that both of us are part of us? That we as a territory, as a culture, the names that we have, the food that we eat, the buildings in the Alhambra Palace in Granada, all of that is Spanish too. Why do you need to think that it's an enemy, an invasion, and not include it in your historical narrative? So the idea is that Muslims are trying to say, well, we are part of Europe. We've been part of Europe in Spain forever. So we need a chance to reshape this country as well. So those are the how they are trying to be included. Now we go to the barriers of against their inclusion. Before I get into nativism, which is a terrible one, some barriers are structural. Some barriers to inclusion of fourth-generation Muslims in the outskirts of Paris have nothing to do with Islam. They have to do with the fact that they live in the outskirts of Paris, in a depressed area with education and a postal code and a surname that do not allow them to find a job. And that other French people do not perceive them as properly French. And that has nothing to do with religion, or with not feeling French, or with not having citizenship. Because fourth generation Muslims in France all have citizenship. Because if you're born in France, you have citizenship. The EU solely, they are trying to modify it, but. So some of the barriers to inclusion are structural and socioeconomic. But here I would like to talk about other barriers of inclusion. I would like to talk about nativism. You've all heard the word nativism. Describing it is not that easy. But you probably heard it also in the context of populism, or in the context of the far right. Is this a far right thing? Is it a nativist thing? Is it a populist thing? So the idea that I'm trying to advocate is that nativism is not necessarily a far right phenomenon. Nativism is a group of people that define themselves as the native group in a country. And they give themselves the right to define how that country is ruled, the essential values of that country. They don't even need to be native. Because if we think of America and we think of Native Americans, you wouldn't think of a Caucasian from Europe. You would think of a Native American. But that doesn't help, because white settlers, and nativism is a phenomenon of white settled societies in many parts, like Australia, like Canada, like the US, they claim to be the native population. They've been here long enough to decide whether you belong here or not, whether there should be a ban against you coming here or not, whether there should be more or less immigration or not. So the problem with nativism is that it feels natural. It feels good. I mean, I haven't, but a nativist can say, I was born here. I remember the way things used to be. My grandparents were here. I've been here all my life. And this place is changing in ways that I don't like. So let's go back to the way it was. So nativism is always kind of like connected with nostalgia, connected with the idea of how, the normative idea of how things should be. Now, oh dear, Islamophobia. The funny thing is that some people pretend that it doesn't exist. That there's no prejudice against Muslims. That the prejudice against Muslims and the fear against Muslims is warranted. Is warranted because they are perceived to be terrorists, they are perceived to be illiberal members of society, they are perceived to be forces that threaten Western values. So when you defend yourself against that tyranny, that intolerance, you are not an Islamophobe. You are actually a patriot defender of the way things should be. And it feels good. But I want to give you, in 1997, in Britain, the Runnymede Trust became really concerned about the issue of discrimination and racism, they call it at the time, against Muslims. And they were trying to define it. They were trying to understand it. And they published this report, which became very famous, called Islamophobia, a Challenge for Us All. And then they have another report, Islamophobia, 20 years later, like we haven't gotten very far. And in this report, they give like a set of criteria that are very useful for all of us when we hear somebody, a comment online, or when we hear someone speaking. For instance, there's this Geert Wilders from the Freedom of Party in the Netherlands. When you hear somebody speaking and you keep these things in mind, it can help you identify the structure of the narrative. And how's the narrative? So Islam is seen as monolithic block, static and unresponsive to change. So Islam is always the same. There's no moderate Muslims, there's no Muslims changing, there's no American Muslims, there's no French Muslims, there's only one Islam. Unresponsive to change, a monolithic block. Then it's seen as separate and other. So West is one thing, Islam is another, there's no way of intermixing. It's one or the other. Which doesn't make sense in many places, but in particular, for instance, in places like Spain, it doesn't make sense at all. So Islam is seen as inferior to the West, barbaric, irrational, primitive, and sexist. That's really important because a lot of the comments that are done against Muslims in Europe today are done under seemingly progressive arguments. Muslims are against the rights of the LGBTQ plus community. Muslims are against the rights of women. Muslims are against sexual freedoms. And of course, Europe is this like sexual freedom like panacea or something. Muslims are against the environment. You can get any progressive argument used against the Muslim community. Muslims are seen as violent, aggressive, threatening, supportive of terrorism, and engaged in a clash of civilizations, all of them. And this is key, Islam is not a religion. Islam is a political ideology used for political or military advantage. In this case, Muslims in Europe are not religious practitioners. They are the vanguard of an invading horde that is coming again to take over the continent. Okay, so the final point is that anti-Muslim hostility is seen as natural and normal. And the more normal it is, the more people voice it. And the more it becomes part of the mainstream discourse. So, how do women in Europe react to this? Laughing? Because you can see at the top, British Pakistani Shana Burkhani, who was like running for a beauty contest. You can see at the top right, Ambreen Sadiq, who is a boxing champion, also a Muslim, of course. You can see at the bottom left, the Catalan Amazigh Najat al-Hashmi, published author with many prizes. And you can see the Somali-Italian Ijaba Shego, another writer, on the bottom left. So these are how Muslim women, some of them, are finding their place in Europe. They are not accepting this idea that Islam is sexist, that Islam limits the way women have to or not behave. They are negotiating their limits between their community and the larger place where they live. And some of them are going into politics. You got two representatives of Congress, but in the North African cities of Melilla and Ceuta in Spain and in the city of Barcelona, you also have Muslim women from Moroccan and Pakistani origin involved in politics, many of them, in great numbers. Now, and we're getting there. Let me see, okay. So now we go to some of the more difficult part of the talk, which is the idea that, yeah, all that is fine, but you know, all the people that you've been talking about, they are a minority. Or all the people you've been talking about, they are just like, their contributions are not at the same level as the ones that are there to threaten our societies or European societies. And we have, for instance, the case of the Je suis Charlie, the terrorist attack against Charlie Hebdo, which was a magazine in France, a satirical magazine that, let's not get into whether it was tasteful or not. It's just a satirical magazine in France, but 17 people were killed in a terrorist attack, many of them cartoonists and journalists of that magazine. After that, Do you remember on social media this idea of I am Charlie, Jesuit Charlie, everyone was Charlie. In Paris, there were 3 million people in a demonstration, the largest demonstration after World War II, with like hordes of prime ministers and presidents from so many countries. And rightly so. It should never have happened. And we should protect ourselves against any kind of terrorism. The problem is that we are blinding ourselves. We only see one kind. And we think that one kind of terrorism is the one that is going to get us. And I also teach courses on fascism and neo-fascism, and I'm very attuned to how things work. I'm actually very worried about terrorism in the name of Islam, but I think there's so many eyes on it. We get it. It's going to still happen because terrorism is very difficult to fight, but I think we have a hold on it. The one that we are not tackling, and it's only going to get worse, is the terrorism in the name of whiteness. Terrorism in the name of white people. And now I would like any Caucasian in the audience to apologize for the terrorist attack that just happened in New Zealand. And you're going to look at me and say, why should I apologize? I mean, that guy is not speaking in my name. I condemn that terrorist attack. It has nothing to do with me. All we have in common is that we're white. That's precisely the point. When a terrorist attack like Jesuit Charlie happens, almost every Muslim is like, are you going to apologize to me? Like, are you going to apologize because they are doing this in your name? Well, now we're even. Now we have all these terrorists that are acting in the name of white people too. So, well, I think it's about time that we put terrorism in the name of white people at the same level as other terrorism, and we tackle them all. Because otherwise, the problem with terrorism is that if we normalize it, if we normalize the ideologies behind it, well, it's only going to get worse. And of course, I don't want to romanticize men like Breivik, the guy that killed 77 young people in an island in Norway that were all members, young members, leaders of the Liberal Party of Norway. But the thing is that these kind of men are acting among us. They are actively recruiting young men on the internet, and they are at various levels of radicalization, but it is the same process of radicalization. Terrorism is a problem for all of us, and we need to look at it holistically. Well, this is very kind of like optimistic, and I'm really sorry not to have a more kind of like optimistic note, but the takeaway from today's talk is that the contributions are real. The contributions of Muslims in America and Europe are real. They are everyday instances. They are on a slow key. They are slowly making our societies better. And if we learn to embrace them, we could avoid falling under the politics of fear that will bring us to seeing these kind of like problems as a zero-sum game. And that's about it for today. Woo, thank you.